Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Miami's Faculty Perspectives contribution to the Race to Imagine conversation. It is my pleasure to introduce Secretary Donna Shalala, who was the Health and Human Services Secretary under the Clinton administration, and she will be moderating the session with Secretary Azar, and she will introduce him as well. Welcome, Secretary Shalala.
Thank you very much, Professor Mortensen. Let me introduce my colleague here, Secretary Alex Azar. Served as secretary during the Trump administration. He had previously served as general counsel and as deputy secretary in the Bush administration, so he's very knowledgeable about our Department of Health and Human Services, which has responsibility for most of the health care that our national government does, and that includes our programs for the elderly and for the poor, as well as the great scientific agencies of NIH, FDA, and CDC, which are well known around the world. Secretary Azar was in particular personally responsible for the development of the vaccines that are now saving millions of lives around the world. And the organization that did it, the strategy is called Operation Warp Speed. And let me start by asking the secretary to talk a little about how they could hit the ground running. And that involves, from my point of view, decades of scientific leadership by both Republicans and Democrats investing in our scientific enterprises in the United States. Secretary Azar?
Well, thank you, Secretary Shalala, and Professor Mortensen. Thank you for hosting this gathering. Secretary Shalala, as you mentioned, as with all scientific endeavors, every incremental step stands on the shoulders of the previous step. So here, with regard to, especially, let's talk in particular about the vaccine program. We could talk about therapeutics, but let's first talk about vaccines. The vaccine program that became most successful most quickly was the messenger RNA program. And that really built on work that our National Institutes of Health at NIH had been doing of a different delivery mechanism of how can you get a protein into the human body in a way that will be expressed by the cells of the human body to provoke the antibody, the immune reaction that you're looking for in a vaccine candidate. And so we had for at least a decade been working at NIH on messenger RNA as a vehicle, as what we thought could be a very efficient vehicle for doing that in the context of, for instance, the Zika virus. There also were companies looking at mRNA as a delivery candidate for, say, oncology products for cancer prevention. So what happened was within 3 days of our scientists getting access to the genetic sequence of the coronavirus in China, our scientists at the NIH had actually developed a vaccine candidate that could be married with the messenger RNA. And what they did is, because we had already been working with Moderna on messenger RNA vaccine candidates, I think it was Zika, we were able to work very quickly with them to hand that off to them and work with them on developing a vaccine. And so within 6 weeks, we went into human trials. So March 16th, I believe it was, which was the fastest in the history of vaccines that a vaccine had ever gone into human clinical trials because of that pre-existing collaborative work between NIH and Moderna. The Pfizer vaccine, of course, uses that same messenger RNA tactic and some of the same information developed at NIH in terms of the core of the vaccine. But even the other vaccines, for instance, the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccines, those are based on a chimpanzee adenovirus vector for the basically common cold vector for getting the protein into the human body and causing replication. There, the J&J work, I had personally been involved with that because that was their vaccine candidate for Ebola, which we did clinical trials on in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. That was going on just the year before COVID. So all of these scientific developments stand on each other and build towards that broader scientific enterprise.
But the key was the execution. That is, how do you take the science and turn it into a vaccine and get the production going? And that involved creating a market and paying for that market,
Yeah, absolutely.
guaranteeing the market.
Yeah,
Please.
and Secretary Shalala, that gets to a question, maybe even anticipating something you would get to. People say, well, warp speed worked so well. Why don't you just do the same thing in other underserved areas like, say, Alzheimer's? You put your finger exactly on the point. This was about execution. Compared to Alzheimer's, where we don't yet have fully validated targets, where we don't know every aspect of Alzheimer's, we don't know what to turn on or turn off to prevent or reverse Alzheimer's. What we knew with COVID was that this was, as we call it, a druggable virus. Why do we know that? Because the human body could naturally recover from COVID without intervention, unlike, say, HIV/AIDS, where the body is unable to mount on its own an effective defense to tackle it. Here, the human body could. So what we knew is if we could signal the body or fool the body into believing it had been infected with COVID when it was not, it could produce the antibodies and defense mechanisms that are vaccination. So that then becomes an issue of execution. And that's where, having run the US operations of a leading pharmaceutical company, and as you mentioned, having been at HHS for 6 years before, I knew how to bring those tools together of the private sector and the government to really solve 5 business problems. The first is alignment on vision. And that was really about dreaming that we could have enough vaccine for all Americans by the beginning of 2021. Very few people thought that was possible. You know, with the media, the scientific experts, this had never been done in human history before. But I used to say something that was, I guess, a bit of a takeoff on the famous ice hockey player Wayne Gretzky. I would say, you fail to achieve 100% of the goals you do not set. You need to motivate a team. You have to have a compelling vision. You won't get there if you don't articulate that. Now, maybe that's not the most politically wise thing to do, because you sometimes don't achieve those things, and that could be regarded as failure. Here, fortunately, we essentially achieved that. The second big thing is personnel. People is policy. So we went to find the best people we could find on earth to tackle these challenges. So we had General Gus Perna, who was the head of U.S. Army Materiel Command for logistics, operations, procurement, contracting, the whole project management. We brought Moncef Slaoui, who was the leading developer of vaccines in the modern history of the world. And we brought in Carlo Di Notari Stefani, who would run global manufacturing operations for one of the world's largest generic and biopharmaceutical companies to solve those problems. The third thing we did is we were able to take money off the table by funding all stages of development of the vaccine. Having been at a drug company, I knew the mentality of drug executives, which is what they call de-risking. You de-risk every stage of developing a drug. You test, check the data, and only then invest in the next stage. Test, check the data, and only then invest. And then at the end, only then, once you know you have a drug, invest in how do you take from the very small production of clinical trial material to the large commercial scale manufacturing. So that third and fourth element, fund all development and fund right up front commercial scale manufacturing, because we had the unlimited financial resources of the US government, we could take all of that off the table. We funded the preparations for all stages of development. We began commercial scale manufacturing of vaccines that we didn't even know if would work, so that we would have hundreds of millions of doses. And then the fifth is the point you made, which is we guaranteed a market, because Zika, MERS, SARS, companies had invested millions in drugs and vaccines there, and those viruses had essentially tapered off. We guaranteed a market by making advanced purchase commitments, no matter what, the US government's going to buy this product.
Talk a little about manufacturing, because there's a limited amount of manufacturing here in this country. It also means that these companies had to stop something else to manufacture at this scale, didn't it?
Yeah, so there is a tremendous amount of what we call small molecule manufacturing capacity around the world. That's the ability to make the pills, for instance.
Right.
There's a great deal of that. But this biologic and protein manufacturing is actually relatively limited. And what you have to do is go from, say, a 200-liter bioreactor in which you're cultivating proteins or biologics and growing them, or a chemical synthesis process for generating proteins. proteins or the entities going into the mRNA, and scale that from a 200-liter production size up to, say, 2,000-liter bioreactors. That is not just a math problem. That cultivation of proteins it's almost more art form than it is science, because these are living organisms and they don't behave in ways that are always completely predictable. And so we even had people have to come out of retirement for various pharmaceutical manufacturing entities to bring sometimes lost expertise on how do you create the feeder cell lines, how do you cultivate growth, how do you get enough replication, how do you filter and purify. This is just one example of how crazy this and how really manufacturing was almost as central to the success of Warp Speed as anything else. When you're pouring out the proteins or the biologics that have been grown on the feeder cell lines and you run them through a filter, we found in one instance that if you pour it through at a certain rate, you could actually get an electrostatic film that clogs the filter, and you could lose that entire lot of vaccine production. You can't predict in advance that's going to happen. It's trial and error in the manufacturing process, which is why we tried to be very conservative initially in planning out distribution, because we always wanted to keep a safety reserve, because especially in early stages of manufacturing, you could very easily have the failure of lots. And with a 2-dose vaccine, we always wanted to make sure we could deliver to people a second dose.
Excellent. A final question, and it has to do with vaccine hesitancy, which we've run into here. Do you think the name Operation Warp Speed actually gave people the impression that this was done very fast? It certainly was done very fast, but that the public actually misunderstood the relationship between building on the science and safety?
We were able to go so remarkably and historically quickly here because of those 5 elements, the 5 business problems that we tackled and solved, not because we cut any corners on safety or proof of efficacy. The name Operation Warp Speed, I'll tell you a little story. Originally, we were just calling it Manhattan Project 2 as a second style, bring the entire power of the US government and private sector together to do something unheard of, or like the Apollo project. The team actually came up with the name Operation Warp Speed. One of the key founders of Operation Warp Speed, Peter Marks, who runs the Biologics Center at FDA, is a Trekkie, a Star Trek person, and he found the name Operation Warp Speed to be a compelling moniker. I will confess, I probably wasn't as big a fan of that, in part because of the reasons that you said, Secretary Shalala. But I also believe, as a leadership principle, you have to allow teams to be motivated by their own scorecards, their own verbiage, their own terminology. And so if this got that team motivated to historic heights and lengths, then so be it. But it and just frankly, the historic success we had meant we had to do a lot of convincing people. These were some of the largest vaccine trials ever in history, 30, 40,000 people in the clinical trials. And that's what allowed us actually to go so quickly, because with so many doses and placebos out there, we could get more infections, which met our statistical significance thresholds faster than, to say, we only had 5,000 people vaccinated with placebo and active ingredient out there. That's one of the key things that allow us to go quickly. Commercial scale manufacturing beginning June of 2020, that's what allowed us to go so quickly. And the FDA held these vaccines to such a high and rigorous statistical efficacy and safety bar. They really meet full standards. They're really the biggest difference between an emergency use and full approval, given how high FDA set the bar, was you need some extra manufacturing inspection validations that were part of the final approval. And you just need a little bit longer term safety data collection in real world evidence as part of that. But these were as close to full on approvals of an emergency use authorization as I think you can get.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's as good an explanation of Operation Warp Speed and your incredible leadership, I think, that we could have heard.
Thank you, Secretary.
Professor Mortensen, back to you.
thank you both for your incredible leadership in a very challenging position, and for both of you during very challenging times. Thank you so much for joining us. You've made us very lucky today. Thank you.